Hey everyone, this is Jacob Stansberry, Family Ministry Director at our Leeds Summit campus. I am joined today by my good friend Jason Briles, who is the pastor at Historical Centennial United Methodist Church, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. And we are going to talk a little bit today about Juneteenth, which is coming up this weekend. And so Jason, can you maybe give us your perspective on what is Juneteenth and why does it matter to us today?
Okay. Yeah, Juneteenth is an annual celebration of the day that blacks in Texas, so in Galveston, Texas, in 1865, were made aware that that they have been granted their freedom from slavery. So a little bit of backstory or history: the Emancipation Proclamation was put into effect in 1863 to go into effect in January 1st of 1865. It wasn't until June 19th until those enslaved Africans or blacks in Texas found out that they in fact had their freedom as granted by the President of the United States. And so for black people in not only in Texas, but it has spread throughout the nation, Juneteenth is a celebration of the baby steps of freedom, right?
Yeah.
And so we look at that as the beginning of freedom in this nation, knowing that not only does the origin have its place in 1865, but we have been building steam and building momentum even up until this day. And also it's looking toward the future, showing that we are capable of a full sprint in freedom in this nation. Yeah.
It's a really interesting thing. So Brian and I, one of our pastors, were talking a couple weeks ago about it was the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa race massacre, and that's not something I learned about in school. Juneteenth is not something I learned about in school. So like I grew up just with kind of this blind assumption, like the Emancipation Proclamation hits and freedom happens at least to some extent,
right?
And yeah, I was well into adulthood, I think, before I found out that that's not quite how it happened.
Yeah, and so it's interesting because my experience was different from you in that way, and I grew up in a historically black Methodist congregation, St. Peter CME, and Juneteenth, the Tulsa race massacre, those are things that we learned about in Sunday school. So so we did not have the luxury of not paying attention to that part of history, because not only is black history, it's American history.
Yeah.
And so at a certain point where we're past that point, but we are now at the point where it's important, if we are going to have any type of restorative justice in this nation, that we have to begin to tell the entire story.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, we can't conveniently pick and choose the portions of history that we would like to use, but we have to tell the whole story.
Yeah.
And truth, I will say this: truth telling leads to restorative justice.
Absolutely. So when you say you talked about picking and choosing, so interestingly, I want to kind of turn toward the faith side of this, because most of the people watching are probably people who at least are curious in faith or in Jesus. So when you think about like the church or God or the Bible and issues around race, like what do you think that God thinks about those things, or what do you think that what does the Bible really say about stuff like race?
Okay.
Because I don't think that it's necessarily accurately portrayed a lot of the times, or just misunderstood entirely.
Yeah, and it's difficult because depending on how you view race, some say that it's a social construct, and there's certainly an aspect of that. But I believe the Bible, even from the very beginning, shows us the humanity in all. So in other words, God created humanity in God's own image, right? And so that doesn't just mean white people, that doesn't just mean black people, but it means all people.
Absolutely.
And I think from Genesis to Pentecost, all the way to the book of Revelation, there's been steps taken to be inclusive as opposed to exclusive. We talk about Pentecost, which we just celebrated here a few weeks ago. There was a representation of people from differing lands and speaking differing languages. That represents to me God bringing people together. No matter what language you speak or your country of origin or the color of your skin, God is bringing people together to pour out God's Spirit upon. Even when we go and look at the book of Revelation, where we see this depiction of the culmination of this age and the bringing together, we see again the bringing together of people from various nations and who speak various languages. So I think that we have at the very beginning a sense of how God views humanity. All people were made in the image of God, and if any of us profess to be people of faith and use the Bible as a sacred text or one that has value, then we have to take that verse seriously, and the concept of the imago Dei, or the image of God, we have to take that seriously. That means my brother, my sister, no matter what their race is, their gender is, or any other thing that distinguishes us, we're all made in the image of God.
That's great. So you kind of alluded to it a little bit, like that there are differing opinions on either how the Bible talks about race, or is it a social construct or whatever. How do you think we most productively have difficult conversations around things like race, especially in a world that is more and more polarized seemingly by the day? So, we all have people in our lives who maybe we disagree with about certain issues. How do we have difficult conversations with people that we just don't agree with?
Yeah, I mean that's the tough, and I mean if I had the answer to that question, I could probably make a lot of money. But seriously, we are in a stage in this nation in particular where it's no longer acceptable to ignore the issue, right? I mean, how long do you allow an illness to go on before you begin to take some responsibility and say, this is an issue and I need to get it fixed? I mean, if you were sick, you would say, I've had this pain for a while now. I need to have someone help me look at it. And so I think the same thing is with racism, especially in this nation. It's gone on for long enough, and I do believe that it's time for us to acknowledge, first of all, and that goes back to truth telling, acknowledge that there is an issue. I mean, there is an issue, but at the same time, it takes people like you who even care to begin to not only have the conversations, but not let people off the hook.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times when things like the murder of George Floyd happens, there's a swelling of activity, of conversation, and then it just slowly dies away. What happens if we just relentlessly continue the conversation and not let people off the hook, not let it die down? In other words, if you have a pulpit or a Bible study or a small group, what if we systematically and consciously keep this conversation as a part of our regular coming together? Because it's going to take that type of effort to make any strides forward.
Absolutely. And you and I have actually talked about this before, because those conversations are great and they're necessary. The truth telling is where it starts. You said earlier, truth telling is what leads to justice. But at some point, we have to get beyond talk, right? At some point, we have to get beyond reading the new book about the topic. And so I know, whether it's people in our church or in our community, I know my wife's a librarian, and the library was putting out resources last summer. Things like how to be an anti-racist or white fragility, those types of materials, which I think are really good places to start.
Absolutely.
But they're a place to start.
Yes.
And so if someone's watching this and they're like, you know what, I've read this book, I've had this conversation, I want to do something now. What do you think is a good next step for someone who's like, I want to start helping us move toward justice?
Well, I think two things, and I'll try to be quick. Number one, we saw the beginning steps of that. Last year, after the murder of George Floyd, we saw our white brothers and sisters stand alongside of us in protest. I mean, that's not just a gesture, but that is prophetic action, right? I mean, that's putting yourself into the space where we need to see white faces. Okay, and so I think that's already a great beginning step, because it only matters so much if it's just black people protesting racism. Yeah, I think but it's a completely different issue when you get on the front lines and say, I'm going to sacrifice because I know that we're all made in the image of God. Yeah. The other thing is, just to use your own influence to and your own resources to begin to make changes in the way we understand race and the way that we understand otherness. So that means your platforms, donating to organizations and causes that are anti-racist and seek to uplift those who are marginalized. Those are ways that we can tangibly make strides towards more equality.
Cool. Well, hey, thank you so much for sharing, for joining us.
Absolutely.
I really, really appreciate it. We hope to hear from you guys in the comments. So if you have questions, if you have thoughts, please share them. This is, like Jason said, a conversation that we're not going to let die down. We're going to continue to have in good and productive ways, and we want you guys to be a part of it. So thank you so much for joining us. Thanks again to Jason, and we will see you guys soon.